Have you ever shared a quiet
with someone
moment
you
only
love
to realize it would stay in your heart forever? I never thought an ordinary
watching
evening
Netflix with my
would
dad
become one of the most emotional,
revealing nights of my life.
What started as a simple plan to binge a
Turned
show
into a
unspoken
gentle
understanding that reshaped
even
how I saw him.
myself.
This isn't just about watching TV. It's about discovering the depth of
that
connection
exists
in the smallest of gestures,
in the silence
between words,
and in
moments too tender to be forgotten. Greetings, dear listeners. Before I begin telling this complicated
story
of my life, I ask you to support our channel. Subscribe,
Leave
and
a
write
like.
in the comments which city you are listening from. This is very important for us. And now, enjoy. I remember
Listening.
that evening with perfect clarity, even though it was supposed to be just a normal
Friday.
The kind of Friday
Night.
where the week's
And
chaos
all you
fades
want
is a little bit of comfort. I had just finished my part-time shift at the cafe, my legs and my
Sore.
mind buzzing with a constant chatter of orders, tips, and small talk. By the time I got home, the sun was dipping below the horizon, streaking the sky with a kind of oranges that made the city look like a watercolor painting. My dad was already in the living room, lounging in his usual armchair with a blanket draped over his legs and a steaming mug of coffee in his hands. "Hey kiddo," he said without looking up. There was a tired warmth in his voice, the kind that makes you feel seen even when words are sparse. "Hey," the first dropping my bag by the door. I was still in my work uniform, apron crumpled hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. But somehow, in that moment, it didn't matter. There was a quiet familiarity in seeing
The same
him
way
there.
he,
For as long as I
had
could
been.
remember, we didn't have to talk about much. One was who communicated in
the kind
small
of dad.
gestures, like refilling my water glass without being asked, or adjusting the blanket around my shoulders when I sank into the couch next to him. Tonight, he even made a little smile when I plopped down beside him, exhausted but relieved to be home. "I was thinking," he said after a pause, "maybe we could just watch something tonight. Nothing heavy. Just us." I laughed softly. That's a novel idea. And so it began. We scrolled through Netflix, each of us silently rejecting countless shows. One has this way of holding the remote like it's a conductor's baton, but without any pretense. We landed on a lighthearted documentary series about the history of jazz. I knew nothing about jazz really, and my dad knew just enough to speak with authority, which made it both educational and funny. The living room was warm, scented faintly with the coffee he had made earlier, and the soft hum of the heater created a cocoon around us. I noticed how the light from the TV flickered across his face, highlighting the small lines around his eyes, the way his hair caught the glow of the screen, and I felt a pang of something tender. I couldn't quite name it. Unassuming, quiet intimacy, the kind of connection that doesn't need grand gestures or loud confessions. We started watching, and at first it was casual. One would lean forward to point something out, and I'd lean in too, trying to see it from his perspective. He asked me questions, genuinely curious, and I answered, feeling a little embarrassed at how little I actually knew. But that was fine. He didn't judge. He just nodded, and sometimes he chuckled at my naive observations. But it was always gentle, never mocking. At one point during a segment about a particularly soulful trumpet solo, one's expression softened in a way I had never noticed before. His calm demeanor gave way to something almost wistful, and I found myself watching him as much as the screen. I realized then that this was a side of him I rarely saw, the quiet vulnerability that was usually tucked away beneath years of responsibility, stress, and the unspoken role of being dad. I cleared my throat, not sure if I should say something, and he caught my glance. "What is it?" he asked, his voice low. I admitted, "I don't know," surprised by the sudden lump in my throat. Sometimes I forget that you have your own life, your own feelings. I just see Dad, the person who always takes care of everything." He smiled a little sadly, but there was pride in it too. "I guess I like it better when you see me that way." I've got my own thoughts too, even if I don't always show them. But yeah, that brief exchange shifted something. Suddenly, the silence between us wasn't empty. It was filled with shared understanding. We didn't need to fill it with chatter or commentary. The music from the documentary, the gentle flicker of the TV light, the quiet breaths it all felt like it was connecting us in ways words never could. I noticed small details I'd overlooked before. The way he always sat with his left leg tucked under him, the subtle way he hums when along, a particularly moving track plays, the slight tremor in his hand when he laughs hard. Each observation made me feel closer to him, as if seeing him fully for the first time. Hours passed in this comfortable rhythm. Sometimes one of us would comment on the show. Sometimes we just sit together in silence. It was unremarkable, yet completely. By the end of the night, I realized that I had learned something about patience, presence, and the quiet ways love can be expressed. I didn't need a dramatic confession or an emotional showdown. Just sitting there, side by side, had changed something in me. As I headed to bed, I glanced back at him in his armchair, still half wrapped in his blanket, eyes closed for a brief moment before the screen light danced across his face. And I really understood that these small, ordinary moments were the ones that mattered. I couldn't have predicted that a night of watching Netflix would leave such an imprint on me. But in that ordinary, unassuming setting, I discovered a depth to my father that I hadn't fully appreciated before, and a new awareness of my own capacity to see and value the people. It was simple, quiet, and incredibly profound. That night became a memory I would revisit often, especially in moments of chaos or self-doubt. A reminder that connection doesn't always roar. It sometimes whispers. After that night, I started noticing my dad in a different way. It was subtle at first, like the way I'd catch him humming under his breath while he washed dishes, or how he paused to watch a bird outside the window, completely absorbed in the ordinary. Before, I might have dismissed those little moments, assuming he was just being dad. But now, they felt puzzle like pieces I hadn't realized I was trying to solve. It was a Saturday morning when it really hit me. I had woken up later than usual, sunlight pouring through the blinds in golden strips across my bedroom floor. I made my way to the kitchen, expecting the quiet emptiness that often greeted me, only to find Juan already there. He was at the counter chopping vegetables, with the kind of concentration that made even the simplest motions seem deliberate. The smell of mingled coffee with the faint aroma of fresh bread. He toasted earlier. I froze for a second just watching him, realizing again how little attention I had paid to these everyday rhythms. "Mornin'," he said. There was something without in the tone, gentle, steady like an anchor in the midst of the day's chaos. "Morning," I mumbled, rubbing sleep from my eyes. I couldn't help but smile at him, feeling that same warmth from the previous night. He slid a plate across the counter toward me. "Scrambled eggs, glistening under the morning light. Eat first, talk," he said later, with a grin that was equal parts stern and playful. I sat down, picking up the fork, and realized that this small act in making breakfast without being asked was part of the quiet, unspoken care that had always been there, but that I had never fully appreciated. As we ate, the conversation started almost casually. Hesitantly, we talked about my week at the cafe, about the new latte orders that kept tripping me up, about his latest project at work. Nothing extraordinary, just ordinary life. But there was a softness in his tone now, a willingness to listen rather than simply respond. And I realized I wanted to tell him more than I ever had before. "Dad," pausing mid-bite, do you ever feel like we don't really notice each other, even when we're together?" He looked at me, fork halfway to his mouth, and blinked. Then he put it down carefully. "All the time," he admitted. "Life moves so fast. I think we're always trying to catch up, and sometimes we forget to just be." It was like he had read my mind, and just like that, the air I wanted to tell him everything. The worries, the frustrations, the little victories that I'd never thought mattered. And he wanted to really hear them. We spent the morning together, in the kitchen,
cooking
and cleaning
over.
I
and
managed to
laughing.
spill more flour than I actually used. At one point, I caught him leaning against the counter, watching
Over
me
the
with
way.
a soft expression, and I felt an ache in my chest. Not sadness, poignant realization that
who
this
had
man
always
seemed invincible had layers I was only beginning to understand. By the time we moved to the living
Later
room,
in
the afternoon, the day had settled into a slow, peaceful rhythm. We brought the same blankets from the night before, made a fresh pot of coffee, and picked a movie. Something light. A comedy that neither of us had seen. I noticed myself watching him more than the screen. He laughed at the silly moments. Of course, but it wasn't a loud, exaggerated laugh of someone trying to fill the room. It was quiet, like thoughtful. Each was a small release of something he carried inside. And then there was the way he occasionally glanced at me. Not in the way he sometimes did when I was younger, but with genuine interest. Like he wanted to see what I was feeling in the moment. I realized that I was learning him all over again. The subtle shifts in expression, the way his hands moved when he was comfortable, the tiny habits that made him him. And I noticed myself opening up too, saying things I hadn't shared before about school, about friends, about the little fears that kept me awake at night. And the most surprising thing, he didn't interrupt, didn't offer advice unless I asked. He just letting the words linger in the room like soft music. There was a trust in that silence, a mutual respect that I had never consciously acknowledged before. It wasn't perfect at one point. I accidentally spilled some coffee on the couch. My heart expecting the frustration I had known from my teenage years. But Juan simply laughed, grabbed a napkin and helped me clean it up. No lecture, no sighs, just steady, calm problem solving. And somehow, that small made me feel closer to him than I had ever felt. By evening, as the movie credits rolled and the room was bathed in the dim glow of the TV, I felt a sense of calm I hadn't known I needed. I realized that the tension I sometimes carried around him, this subtle, unspoken pressure to perform, to be the good daughter, was easing. We were just two people, sitting together, sharing a quiet life. In the simplest way possible, was more meaningful than anything traumatic or planned. As we and moved toward the kitchen for more coffee, I caught a glimpse of him through the doorway, standing in the soft light, the shadow of the evening settling behind him. And I understood something vital. Love doesn't always announce itself with fireworks. Sometimes, it lives in these unremarkable spaces. Gentle. The quiet mornings, the shared blankets, the accidental coffee spills, the words that are spoken, and the ones that are left unspoken. And in that understanding, I felt a shift within myself. I realized that I could carry this connection with me beyond these moments, that I could bring patience and care. I wasn't just learning about my dad. I was learning about myself, about how to listen, and how to truly be present. When the night finally drew in, and we both settled into our own spaces, I found myself lingering in the doorway for a moment, just watching him. He had that quiet, reflective look on his face. The kind that makes you wonder behind those eyes. I smiled softly and whispered almost to myself, "Thank you for being here for this." And though he didn't hear me, I knew he would understand. Because that's the beauty of moments like these. They don't need explanation. They leave an imprint, quiet but undeniable, that shapes how you see the people you love. And sometimes, how you see yourself. By the end of that weekend, I realized that I was holding onto something that would stay with me forever. The sense that connection doesn't have to be grand, to be profound. And the small, ordinary moments with one, the shared laughter, the gentle the mutual respect, were quietly teaching me the true weight of love. It started with an ordinary, but like so many of the moments with my dad, it ended up being anything but. I had spent the day at the library, buried in books and assignments, feeling the usual exhaustion that came with trying to balance work and the chaotic swirl of everything else in life. When I walked in the door, the apartment was unusually quiet. No TV, no music, just the soft ticking of the wall and clock, the distant hum of the heater. Juan was in the kitchen, leaning against the counter, with his arms crossed, a contemplative look on his face. The first thing I noticed was the way his eyes softened when he saw me. That quiet, almost invisible smile he made the weight of the day ease off my shoulders, like the gentle pull of a tie. "Hey, kiddo," he said, his voice carrying that same calm warmth I had come to cherish. "You look tired." I admitted, dropping my bag by the door and letting out a long sigh. "It's been one of those days where everything happens at once." He nodded knowingly, and for a moment we just stood there, neither of us speaking, the silence stretching comfortably between us. I realized that the more I spent time with him, I appreciated these quiet pauses. They weren't awkward or empty. They were a space to breathe, to exist without expectation. "Why don't we just sit for a bit?" he suggested. No screens, no distractions. I hesitated just momentarily, caught off guard by the simplicity of the invitation, but the warmth in his eyes, the gentle tilt of his head, made it impossible to refuse. We settled on the couch blankets draped across our laps, and I felt the familiar sense of comfort I had started to associate with these evenings. We didn't start talking immediately. Instead, we listened to the quiet hum of the city outside, the occasional, distant subtle creak of the apartment ceiling. And then Juan, began to share a story from his own youth. A time I had never heard about, when he was my age, struggling to find direction after college. His voice was soft, hesitant at first, but as he spoke I could hear the pride and regret woven into the memories. "I made a lot of mistakes back then," he said, his eyes fixed on some invisible point in the room. "But I learned slowly, painfully, that some things are worth holding on to, and some things you just have to let go." I felt a lump form in my throat. I had never really considered my dad as a person who had wrestled with fear and uncertainty, someone who had stumbled and struggled, just like me. For so long, I had only seen him as the steady, unshakable presence in my life. Hearing him speak so openly made him more real, and it deepened the connection between us in a way I hadn't anticipated. "I think I get that," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "I feel like I'm always rushing, trying to figure everything out, and I forget to notice what really matters." He turned to look at me, and for the first time, I noticed the faint traces of weariness in his eyes. The subtle lines around them that spoke of years of care and responsibility. Amber noticing, "That's what matters. The rest, it finds its way." Eventually, we sat in that quiet understanding for a long time, the room bathed in the soft glow of the evening light filtering through the blinds. And then almost instinctively, we reached for the blankets, wrapping ourselves a little tighter, as if the physical closeness could somehow mirror the emotional connection growing between us. Later, we decided to watch something light, a documentary about famous painters. The kind of thing neither of us would usually choose, but somehow felt right. The film played, but my attention kept drifting to him. I watched the way he tilted his head when a painting caught his interest, the gentle furrow of his brow when he was lost in thought, the quiet laughter that escaped him at a subtle joke in the narration. It struck me how much I had missed in our relationship by assuming I knew him completely. There were layers too that I was only now beginning to see. The humor he kept tucked away, the quiet reflection he often reserved for himself, the steady empathy that had always been there, but that I had taken for granted. At one point, he reached over and gently nudged my hand with his, but it felt like a bridge across all the years I had thought I already understood him. I squeezed his hand back, and for the first time, I felt like we were truly meeting each other in this space, without the weight of expectations, without the usual roles of parent and child. As the evening wore on, I noticed a change within myself. I felt lighter, more aware of the depth of our bond. I realized that these quiet evenings weren't just about spending time together. They were about discovering parts of each other always waiting there to be noticed. and in noticing them, we were learning about ourselves as well. When the film ended, we didn't rush to turn off the TV. Instead, we sat together in the dim glow, letting the silence stretch comfortably. I felt a deep sense of gratitude for this man who had quietly guided me, supported me, and now in ways I hadn't expected, allowed me to see him as he truly was. "Thanks, Dad," I said softly, breaking the silence. "For this. For being here. For letting me see you." He smiled, a faint, almost shy smile that made my chest tighten. "Thank you," he replied, "for noticing. Amba, for being here too. It means more than you know." I realized then that our relationship had shifted. We weren't just father and daughter, going through the motions of everyday life. We were two people learning to appreciate the small, tender moments, to see and be seen, and to understand the patient love that underpinned everything we shared. By the time I went to bed that night, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in months. I reflected on the subtle discoveries of the evening, the depth of his patience, the quiet wisdom, the gentle encouragement that didn't come in shouts or lectures, but in presence and attention. And I realized something profound. Love and understanding aren't always loud or dramatic. Sometimes they exist in the quietest moments, in the shared glances and the hands brushing together, in the soft, reflective conversations that come when you least expect them. That night, as I lay in bed, I made a silent promise to myself. I would pay attention, I would notice. I would cherish the quiet moments, not as ordinary events, but as lessons in presence, empathy, and the subtle ways that love, because I knew even manifests, that these small discoveries, these tender, fleeting connections, were shaping me in ways I would carry for the rest of my life. And that realization, more than anything else, made the ordinary evening extraordinary. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon, the kind that feels suspended in time, the kind where the world outside just enough for you to catch your breath and notice what really matters. I had spent the morning reading in my room, wrapped in a blanket that smelled faintly of my dad's laundry detergent. The city outside hummed softly, distant car blending with the occasional chatter of neighbors' horns. When I walked into the living room, Juan was already sitting cross-legged on the couch, a book in his hands. He looked up and smiled, that familiar warmth that always made me feel like I had returned home. Not just to a place, but to a sense of calm and understanding. "Hey kiddo," he said, "before you get some reading in." I laughed softly and joined him on the couch, settling into the space beside him. The blankets, the gentle hum of the day, it all felt like a cocoon. We didn't need a plan, we didn't need a show or a movie. Just being together was enough. For a while we read in silence, each absorbed in our own pages. But then something shifted. I noticed him glancing at me every now and then, not out of distraction, but as if he wanted to make sure I was truly present, not just physically, but emotionally. It was a gesture so small, so subtle, but it carried a weight I couldn't ignore. "Amba," finally he closing his book and setting it aside. "Do you remember? We watched that jazz documentary together." I nodded, smiling at the memory. "Yeah, I remember thinking it was just a normal night. Until it wasn't." He chuckled softly, the kind of laugh that comes from deep inside, the one that makes you realize how much he has lived, felt, and carried. I felt the same way. "I didn't expect it to turn into this," he said, gesturing between us with a sweep of his hand, as if encompassing everything. Our shared blankets, the quiet room, the unspoken bond that had grown between us. I reached out and took his hand, a small, instinctive gesture, and he squeezed back, gentle and reassuring. It struck me then how far we had come. The awkwardness of teenage years, the subtle tensions, the moments where we misread each other, they all felt like shadows compared to what we had now. There was a depth, a mutual recognition of each other's humanity that had transformed our relationship. "I feel like I'm just starting to understand you," I admitted, my voice soft. "Not just Dad, but you." The person beyond all
You
the responsibilities and expectations. He looked at me, eyes and for a
thoughtful.
moment I saw a flicker of vulnerability I hadn't noticed before. And I feel the same about you. I've watched you grow into someone incredible, and I think I've learned to see you, not as my little girl, not as a reflection of me, but as your own person. That acknowledgement hit me harder than I expected. It wasn't a dramatic revelation, but it was profound. It was the quiet understanding that we had moved past and labels and had met with each other fully and love. We spent the next few hours talking, but differently than before. Not just about work, school, or the shows we watched. We shared dreams, fears, and little confessions we had kept tucked away. He told me about the moments he doubted himself as a father, the mistakes he thought he had made, and how he had learned to forgive himself. I shared my insecurities, my ambitions, and the ways I sometimes felt overwhelmed by life. And through it all, there was no judgment, only presence. At one point I paused mid-sentence, realizing how rare this kind of connection was. Dad, do you know how much all of this means to me? He smiled, the kind of quiet, knowing smile that felt like a hug in itself. I do now, he said, and I'm glad we found it. Later we decided to go for a walk. The winter sunlight had softened into a golden haze, casting long shadows on the streets. The air was crisp, and every breath felt invigorating, yet comforting at the same time. We walked side by side, our steps synchronized in a way that felt effortless. We didn't need to fill the space with words, because the silence between us was comfortable, filled with shared understanding. As we passed, I paused to watch a small pigeon across the grass, the laughter echoing softly in the open space. One stood beside me, hands in his pockets, and I realized how much I had taken for granted. His presence, his quiet, with subtle ways, he showed without demanding attention or recognition. You know, after a while, these quiet moments, they're the ones I remember the most. Not the big events, not the celebrations, but the simple, unremarkable ones. They stick with you. I nodded, feeling the truth of his words settle in my chest. Me too, I admitted. I think I've learned more about life in these small evenings than anywhere else. We walked a little longer, and as the sun dipped lower, casting a warm glow across the buildings, I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. Gratitude for him, for the lessons he had taught me, really trying. Gratitude for being able to see for myself and appreciate those lessons. Gratitude for the quiet, ordinary moments that had turned extraordinary simply because we had experienced them together. When we finally returned to the apartment, we didn't rush to do anything. We made tea, wrapped ourselves in blankets, and settled in the living room once more. The TV remained off. The world outside continued its quiet hum, and for the first time in a long time, I felt completely present, completely at peace. He said softly, breaking the comfortable silence, I hope you remember this. Not just the big milestones, not just the achievements or celebrations, but these moments, they're what life really is. I will, I whispered, squeezing his hand again. I won't forget. And in that simple exchange, I realized something profound. Love doesn't need grand gestures or dramatic words. It exists in presence, in listening, in shared silence, in noticing the details that make someone who they truly are. It exists in patience, in mutual respect, and in the quiet commitment to see and understand each other fully. As I finally headed to bed that night, I looked back at him one last time. He was reading quietly, the soft glow highlighting the gentle lines of his face. I felt an overwhelming sense of connection, a realization that this ordinary evening, like so many, was extraordinary in the way it had shaped me, opened my heart, and deepened my understanding of love. That night, I fell asleep with a sense of gratitude and clarity. I hadn't known before I understood that our bond was more than father and daughter. It was a meeting of hearts, a recognition of shared humanity, and a lesson in patience, empathy, and presence. It was one of those rare, quiet moments that stay with you forever. And as the days and months would pass, I knew I would carry that evening with me always. The warmth, the laughter, the shared silences, and the quiet understanding that some of the most meaningful experiences in life come not from grandeur, but from simply being there for each other.